All right, our next interview is with Dan Siegel of M&S Books.
M&S Rare Books.
M&S Rare Books, formerly of Western Mass, where I first met Dan. Dan, tell us a little bit about your background, family, schools, where you grew up, a little bit about that, a little capsule.
Well, I'm Midwestern. I was born in Wheaton, Illinois. Went to Wheaton Elementary School, a home school, through 6th grade. Moved to the North Shore of Chicago, Glencoe specifically. Attended junior high in Glencoe, and then to Newter Township High School in Winnetka for my 4 years of high school. And then I went to Brown University as an undergraduate. Was a philosophy major there. Upon completing that, I went to the University of Iowa to the Writers' Workshop there to become a novelist, and got a Master's of Fine Arts and a Master of Arts and Humanities at the same time. And then got married in 1960. I was at Brown 53 to 57 and Iowa 57 to 59, and got married in 1960. And moved to Weston, where my wife and I rented a house for 2 years, deciding whether we wanted to stay in the area. And I began writing the great philosophical novels of the day, which no one especially wished to publish, probably with good reason. Anyway, we bought a house in 1962, as it turned out, in Weston, and continued to live there and write until about the late 60s, when I decided, since we by then had 2 children, M as in Matthew and S as in Stephen, and I thought I should do something a little more visible that they would understand. And meanwhile, when I was writing, I worked from about 10 at night till 4 in the morning, and then would sleep till noon and go out in the afternoons. And one of the things I did was work for Harold Burstein as a cataloger. Took most of my pay in books, and I had started collecting books in the Boston area circa 1962, and educated myself as to what it was all about. Discovered there were auctions in New York, and there were auction records, and lots of dealers and things of that nature, and just became more educated and saw what Harold Burstein did, and as I say, worked for him for off and on as I chose to come in for a period of a couple of years, met people like Ken Leach, and finally decided I would go into business. I also wanted to do publishing because there were things I would like to publish. I was very interested in the writings of John J. Chapman. One of the things I bought from Harold Burstein was the Provisional Constitution for the United States that was written by John Brown. As it turned out, he wrote it in Canada in 1858 and had it printed by a colored printer there. And that was the first book I published as a publisher. And as I say, I saw how Harold operated as both a publisher and a rare book dealer, and decided I could do some of those things and wished to issue catalogs. And in 1969, I published the Provisional Constitution in a facsimile edition. In 1970, I published 3 or 4 more works, and my first rare book catalog came out, I believe, in April of 1970. And I have produced either 2 or 3 catalogs a year since then. When I had people working for me, 1969 to 72, I had David O'Neill, and we produced 3 catalogs a year. And when I had Tim Wilder working for me, 81 to 84, we did 3 catalogs. Other than that, working on by myself, I did 2 catalogs a year.
So you've had some people who've gone on to be booksellers on their own.
Both of them did that, yes.
Yeah. Work with you and for you.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the early days when you first started in the trade, who were some of the people who were like mentors or people you could ask for advice, or somebody you looked up to as somebody in the trade you'd like to emulate?
Well, other than you, Mike, I don't know that there were too many that I really, asked a lot about. As I say, I did learn a lot from Harold Burstein, observing how he operated, and decided what I liked about what he did and what I didn't necessarily care for and what I would like to do for myself. But I did get to know Howard and Phyllis Mott quite well in those days, and if it was anybody that I might consider a mentor to some degree, just mostly based on the catalogs and personalities of them, I would say those could be the people. But, you know, I was going to New York in those days and got to know John Cohen at Seven Gables, and of course I knew George Goodspeed in Boston, and I knew Sam Morrill. So, you know, I basically observed how others operated their business, and I had been buying books at auction through Mike Walsh at Goodspeed's, and Harold Graves at Scribner's Rare Bookshop in New York.
I liked Harold.
Yeah, no, I liked him very much. Of course, he closed in '72, but, you know, I published the facsimile of the manuscript of Orwell's 1984
Right.
as sort of the non-American reform and thought publication that M&S Press has done.
Yeah.
And I tell the story in the preface about my acquisition of that manuscript, which was on my trip to New York in 1969 to tell dealers in New York that I was going into business. And when I was at Scribner's, Harold already knew that I was going into business. There was no great news to anybody in New York that I was doing this. And after we got done looking for things for my business, which were, you know, inexpensive pieces of literature chiefly, he said, something just came in, I'd like to show it to you. And of course, as a dealer, I'm saying, no, I'm not buying for myself here, but what is it?
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
So, you know, he showed it to me, and of course it was mind-boggling to see the manuscript of Orwell's 1984.
Yeah, it must have been mind-boggling. Which came first, the antiquarian books or the publishing?
Well, I began as a collector, as I say, in the early 60s, and some of the things that I was able to collect, you know, really intrigued me. I had been reading John J. Chapman. I'd gone to Harvard. I lived in Cambridge for a brief time in 1959, and I went and read the letters of John J. Chapman. You know, he was one of the greatest American letter writers there ever was. And so I wrote all those, and sort of the prospect of writing a novel about them. But I get very interested in John J. Chapman, and I was buying a lot of things inscribed by John J. Chapman and so forth and so on. And I did want to publish him. As I say, I wanted to publish the Provisional Constitution. I thought that would be very intriguing, and it would be a good first project for someone like me who was knew nothing about publishing per se. But here it was a very small book that would show me everything there was to know, basically about what I needed to know about it being a reprint publisher at a rather low expense, since it was a very small book. So I published that first. And the Chapman, of course, is a 12-volume set, which came, you know, not that much later, but you know, by then I felt I knew what I was doing more or less in terms of what was required to publish at that time.
How has the internet helped or affected you?
Well, people say to me, well, the internet must have changed your business completely, and I say, no, it hardly has affected it at all. It may, you know, certainly affect business in the future for people. One of the things that has been said, of course, is that there's less catalogs produced as a result of the internet. My reaction is to repeat what I said to you a few moments ago, that I still publish 2 catalogs a year, as I have for a long time. I find I sell much better out of my catalogs than I do off of my website. I was always amused when I did put up a website about, I don't know, 8 years ago, I suppose. I thought, you know, my customers, my mailing list, would be very enthused to see my website, and I put that information in my catalog so they would know where to go. And I put in onto my website all the inexpensive material I didn't put in catalogs, and assumed they would be very interested in that. And then, of course, there's older material that they would have another chance at. Well, I do sell on the internet. I'm not saying I don't, but out of those people on my catalog mailing list, I would say in 8 years I've had 8 orders.
That's it.
Whereas when I put a catalog out, you know, I have 60, 80 orders within 2 weeks. They like, the institutions in particular, who are the majority of my mailing list, like the catalog.
Yeah. I've been told by a number of librarians that they see a book on the internet that's more expensive than someone else, but they would prefer to buy the more expensive book because they know the reputation of the dealer selling it.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, for me, it is true. As I say, that may well change. But for me, it is true currently because I don't always check everything out in terms of price on the internet. And sometimes don't care. If I've paid X dollars, I'm going to try to get Y dollars for it. And I price it as I see fit. And sometimes I do check later and, happen to see that, oh, gee, you could have bought that cheaper than in my catalog, but they've bought it.
Yeah.
I do think institutions, my take on it is that institutions like a dealer with who they know.
Yeah,
I think that's why I say my catalogs.
Excuse me.
Bless you. My catalogs have given me, I believe, a great credibility, in 40 years, and I do think that institutions appreciate the fact that when they come to me, they know they're going to get, generally speaking, what I've described, and they know they can return it if they wish, and they know that I'm not going to say, pay me today.
Right.
They're going to
important issues.
They're going to pay on their terms if it's 30 days, hopefully. But if it's not, if it's somewhat longer, it's that's the way it is. So I do think there's a lot of reasons for them to do that, to take the more expensive copy because it saves them time and money in ordering from other people and returning material, et cetera, et cetera.
Bad or, What percentage of your business would you say is generated through your catalogs?
That's something I've never really figured out, but I would say it's a pretty high percentage. I wouldn't be surprised if it's probably represents 2/3.
Yeah, about 2/3. The other third comes from the internet, or
well, some on the internet, some dealer visits.
a lot of dealer visits, I would imagine.
It's waxed and waned. Currently, in the last year, I've had a couple of dealers coming to me frequently. Sometimes, book fair time, there will be somebody who comes. But I had more dealers coming to me when I was in Western Massachusetts because of Concord being a nearby community, people visiting there in the summer, and then they would come over and see me. I don't get that sort of traffic anymore. I get mostly dealers who come to see me. So there is, some of that. But that's not a large part of the business. It's, as I say, I do have internet business too.
Well, talk a little bit about book fairs. At one time, you were a book fair exhibitor, and now you are not a book fair exhibitor. Well, could you talk a little about the reasons why?
Sure, I've talked about that today with other dealers who have gone in my direction, more or less. I did my first book fair when the first Boston Book Fair was held, which was, I guess, 1977 or 78.
Yes,
one of those years. I thought I should support the local chapter, and I did not think I wanted to do book fairs particularly. But I thought, A, I should support the organization, and B, I thought I should find out whether what I believed was true or not. So I did the first fair, and I did the second fair. And in those 2 years, I did a New York fair and a San Francisco fair. And I found going to San Francisco was an interesting experience for me. This is probably 78 or 79. I sold, I believe, one book for about $3,500, so I probably broke even for the fair, for the cost. And the person in the booth next to me was Larry McMurtry, who I did not know who Larry McMurtry was at that time. I bought a very nice early medical book from him, I recall, and of course I got to understand who he was as a writer and started reading his books when I got back, which I think was a high point of doing that book fair. When I don't know if you want me to name any names, but I was quite amused at the first, I think it was the first fair on Sunday in Boston. Sunday was typically a pretty quiet day. And started getting dealer visitors looking for, lower prices.
Yeah.
And
What can you do for me?
Yeah, what can you do for me? As I said, I don't know if you want me to mention who it was, but
It's not necessary. A general comment will do.
one dealer in particular came around who was a big-time dealer, and he wanted to know what I could do for him, and I allowed us how beyond my usual 10%. I didn't plan to do anything. Going to Weston from Boston was not a big trip for me to take my material back, and so it wasn't a matter of shipping anything. And anyway, we started chatting, and he asked me how I had done. And I said, well, I sold $7,000 worth of books, which is, okay, 1977, 78. It was fine. I had no problem with it. And he said, oh, well, we did $50,000 in business. And I, of course, was astonished and impressed.
Yeah.
And then he explained to me, he said, well, we sold 20 and we bought 30. On that basis, I did better than the 7.
Well, that seems to be a typical comment that you hear nowadays.
Is it?
Yeah. So you just decided that book fairs had served their purpose?
Well, my feeling was, as I say, going into them, that I didn't really care for them. I used to be a much taller person than I am now, but doing 3-day book fairs, I find that the ABA runs, it shortened me considerably.
I used to be 7 feet tall.
Exactly. So I do think they're arduous, and I am impressed and amazed at the people who do them and schlep material back and forth to them and do them, year round. I admire them. It's not for me. It's just too arduous. And as I run a one-man business, if I'm out of town, particularly in New York or San Francisco, it's somewhat problematic to be gone a week and have all that work ahead of you when you get back. But I also found, of course, that for about the same amount of money, I can produce a catalog which will take in anywhere from 10 to 100 times as much money as I can do in a book fair. Now, I think there's good reasons to do book fairs, and I'm sorry that I don't do them for those reasons. I come here today. I'm coming mainly, I don't come Friday nights anymore. I used to. I don't now because I don't want to take the time of the book dealers on a Friday night when they're hoping to do very good selling. But I come down mostly to chat. See people I don't see the rest of the year.
It's the only time you see them.
That's right, and I like a lot of the people who are doing these fairs. I like book dealers, and I think the sociability of the fair is a wonderful thing, and I'm not really participating in it to the degree I recognize I could. But as I say, I just found that doing catalogs is so much more efficient in terms of selling material for me. I sell most of my material to institutions. And, it's the catalog that's going to do that for me.
Stuart Bennett, our current president, I interviewed a little while ago, and he made the comment that he felt that the book trade, basically the ABAA, would implode at some point in the near future because the average age of the ABAA member is 55/60 and up. Do you think that that's a prophecy, or how do you see it?
Well, we've been talking about that on the listserv for some years. A lot of changes are coming, obviously, to the book world and to book selling. Some of us my age, or nearly, like to say, and we've said now for some years that it's just as well we're the age we are, because if we weren't, with the paucity of the kind of material that we like to deal in, compared to some years ago, why we would all be selling modern literature, which most of us don't want to be doing.
Some do, some don't.
Yeah, so, there is that kind of issue has certainly been staring us in the face. But, I do look at it. When I joined the ABAA in 1972, I suppose, or 73, there were 450 dealers. Today, I believe there are 450 dealers. So things haven't changed a whole lot, and they weren't the youngest spring chickens in 1972 or 3 either. Clearly, they have gotten older, and getting young people is always an issue for the organization. Whether it's actually going to implode or not over that, I don't know. I think it's a question of the kind of material that's available to be resold that people can acquire. I think that's an issue.
It's a big issue.
Yeah.
Especially as we go into the future. What do you see as some of the big challenges that we face as booksellers looking ahead 5, 10, 15?
Well, as I say, to me, the paucity of material. I mean, I was just talking with someone who had observed about my catalogs that have changed over the years. He said, you sell much more manuscript material than you ever did. And I say, well, that's absolutely true, and it's a very studied decision, really, because the kind of printed material that I was able to acquire easily and pretty cheaply back in the 70s and 80s isn't out there anymore to be acquired at any price.
Right.
So also you have institutions who will not buy a second copy of some important book, because second copy meaning there's another copy in their state or in an adjoining state.
Right.
So they see no reason to buy it, and they can sell the concept of buying something on the basis that it's good for research. And certainly manuscript material, all of which is unique, is very good research material. And so some years ago, I decided to start acquiring that. I did acquire a good deal of it, and I had a problem in Rhode Island when I moved down there, having a fair amount of it, and it was all one catalog because, of course, it's very time-consuming to catalog. Initially, I didn't like to buy it either because you couldn't sell anything. If it wasn't Washington's letters, you weren't going to sell it, and now you can sell, ordinary material, ledgers and journals about the workaday world of colonial New England, which I enjoy doing, and you can, I hire someone to write that up, and it's pretty interesting stuff, and you have institutions in particular that want to buy it for research purposes. It's much easier for them to sell the concept of research on something that's unique, and all manuscripts are unique.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, I want to ask you the same question I ask everybody we interview. If a young person would come to you and say, Mr. Siegel, I'd like to become a bookseller, what advice would you give them? We're talking about now. This is 2009.
Well, I had my son working for me briefly when he was in high school or college, and this is, of course, some years ago. I think he worked for me a little bit at the first antiquarian book fair in Boston. And I said to him one day, you need passion to do this. If you do not have the passion for what it is that you and I are doing, I don't think it's a good field to be in. So, you need to develop a passion, and the question to me would be to ask him is, well, what is it about this? Yeah, what is it? I mean, is there a particular field of collecting or of selling that interests you in particular? Is there an area you know something about that you feel you could deal with well? And if I'm not going to encourage them to do it if they don't arise to that point.
Without passion.
Well, it's a very bookselling is a very unique profession, if I may call it a profession. It is different. It is a lot of the people. I said once, I remember at least once at a book fair at the end of the night, saying to some of the dealers that I knew, look at this group, totally unemployable. Lucky we're book dealers. And, there is that aspect. I mean, we have one firm called Second Life Books, and that is expressive of a great number of people who are in this business. They are doing it because they have arrived at a decision about doing it, whether they've left academic life or corporate life or simply retired and want to do something else. They have arrived at bookselling as an activity to do which they love. And that's what it takes, in my opinion, to do it. And what that means for young people coming into it, I don't know.
Great interview. Thanks very much, Dan.